Hello, good evening, and welcome to the 6th annual NextNotes High School Music Creator Award Ceremony. My name is Garrett McQueen, and it is my absolute privilege to be your host for today. I have lots of really great conversations and even better music coming up for you to hear. But first, what exactly is NextNotes? Well, I'll tell you. NextNotes is a program designed to nurture the next generation of creative voices in music. And by the way, that's music in any and all styles. This national program serves as a space for young artists to convene as a cohort, to receive mentorship, scholarship funds, to participate in musician workshops, and to get recognition through this award ceremony. The ceremony looks a little different this year, as I'm sure you can understand, but the American Composers Forum has done a phenomenal job of making sure that this year's honorees still get that recognition that they've earned. Here's the ACF's president and CEO, Vanessa Rose, to talk with you about what the American Composers Forum is and to offer a few thanks.
Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to join you today. ACF is a national organization based in Minnesota. Doing our work from the Midwest helps us recognize the many artistic communities around this nation and the power of music within them. Our mission is to illuminate and amplify the relevance and vitality of today's music by supporting and advocating for the individuals creating music and their art. There's no better example of this than NextNotes, recognizing the 6 amazing artists we are presenting with awards today, as well as the many other young people creating music in their own unique way. If you're watching this, you are part of our shared ecosystem. For those of you who are high school-aged individuals creating music, we see you and we can't wait to hear your music. For the grown-ups watching, we encourage you to support the young artists in your life. We want to hear from them. Congratulations to KiMani Bridges, Helen Feng, Jean Angelo Nucal, Rohan Srinivasan, Jasper Talwani, and Charlotte Weinstein. Thank you to our mentors, Joe Horton, Mary Ellen Childs, and Marcos Balter, and of course the program's director, ACF staff member, Laura Kreider. We are grateful to the Thelma Hunter Fund and her family, the Augustine Foundation, Rosemary and David Good Family Foundation, Dr. Fred Noah Gordon Charitable Fund of the Minneapolis Foundation, Robert and Pearl Burgad, and the additional generosity of ACF contributors. It is an honor to have our ACF board member, Garrett McQueen, MC this event. Garrett is a bassoonist, host, and producer of the nationally syndicated radio program, Music Through the Night on American Public Media, and is executive producer and owner of Trilloquy, a podcast that features true and real conversations that challenge the status quo of classical music. Check out Trilloquy.org and you'll see us talking about the recent difficult events in our shared home in the Twin Cities and how it impacts artists. Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you enjoy the event.
Thank you so much for those words, Vanessa, and thanks again to all of you who've helped make this possible. So over 140 students from across the country submitted materials to NextNotes, and tonight you and I have the distinct honor of celebrating 6 of those very talented creators. And I use that word creator very intentionally. This year, the NextNotes team decided to change the program from one that celebrates high school music composers to one that celebrates creators. This is just to emphasize the ACF's dedication to validating and supporting all music and all who create it. In that spirit, this year's honorees were given the opportunity to work with 3 very different, but 3 very complementary professional music creators, Marcos Balter, Mary Ellen Childs, and Joe Horton. I should also mention that in partnership with the Make Music program, we're proud to acknowledge the very influential teachers of the 2020 NextNotes program. Each of tonight's honorees nominated a music educator in their life, and we've honored each of them with the subscription to Smart Music, which is an interactive music software program for use in the classrooms. A huge thank you and congratulations to all of the music educators. So how about you and I hear from tonight's honorees? Does that sound all right? Yes? Great, let's do it. Tonight's first honoree is Helen Fung. If you're big on TED Talks or TEDx Talks, you might have a name that sounds familiar to you. About a year ago, she spoke to a crowd at Massachusetts Deerfield Academy on the topic of music and cultural appropriation. A big honor for such a young creator, isn't it? She's also a really phenomenal pianist and vocalist who wrote a piece of music for piano and voice. It's called Soaring to the Past, Jin Se. You'll hear a sample of that here in a few minutes. In the meantime, though, I'd like to share a bit of the conversation I had with Helen about a week ago. Take a look.
Yeah, classical music is so, as we know, full of a history of, like depending on the legacy of racism, of like cultural dominance, power dynamics. and there's just like it's necessary to feel challenging and on one part, but on another hand, I've come to realize that just like in my continual learning process, that like that art, that awareness and just thinking about things shouldn't and can't and doesn't actually stifle creativity.
Hmm.
It doesn't have to.
Yeah, and I'm sure the, you know, the perspectives that you've gotten living in so many different places kind of has served as a catalyst in your broadening awareness and just understanding more of the world than so many of us currently do.
Thank you. And
We use this phrase classical music, but in itself, you know, that's sort of a cloudy phrase. You know, how do you
yeah,
define that phrase classical music? If someone were to ask you what is classical music, what would you tell them?
I think classical music is a very VJ Iyer, the jazz pianist, he really inspires me with this idea of like genre is, instead of saying genre, let's say community. And instead of and sometimes language is a very convenient, sometimes it can be used in a convenient way to like categorize, to help us make sense of things. And to me, classical music is also like that. Classical, the word classical, it's just like sometimes people cannot find a better word. There isn't sometimes a better word, because like when I name my Spotify playlists, I've had a fair amount of struggle for that. Do I say concert music, or do I say classical? Do I say Western classical, or do I say, I think it's just it's a label of a tradition that is in itself a process that is evolving, and that it isn't rigid, and a lot of it is yeah, there are like hints of the convention, but it's growing and growing, and it's merging with so many other communities of music.
And you know, going back to the past, of course, makes me think about the piece of music that you've written, "Soaring to the Past." So we talk so much about classical, so-called classical music and its instruments, but you wrote this piece of music for piano and voice. Was there any specific idea behind using the instrument of the voice for this piece of music?
Yeah, because first of all, like those are my two instruments, and I just wanted to, like, just embracing both of those instruments as part of my identity. Is this piece is very personal, has a very personal connection to it, and the poem that I said by Li Shangyin, the poet, he's like one of my favorite Chinese poets. He just like, there's so much ambiguity, romanticism, and like impressionistic feelings in that poem. It just made me, just like when I read it in text, I just felt like, wow, this is this is so colorful. He uses a plethora of like, like imagery, allusions to historical myths, idioms that a lot of Chinese idioms comprise of. Like they all have story behind those. You have to kind of know the stories to understand like where these all fit together. That was just fascinating to me. Like story after story and story after story, identity after identity. It's like a buildup of history. And then I'm thinking, wow, I was here there in the library reading this. I was like, wow. Then I'm having this conversation with what Li Shangyin is writing.
I want to apply, you know, again, this conversation of cultural competency,
Mm.
cultural appropriation to this piece of music. So, do you feel like that you are uniquely placed to set a poem like that to music? Do you feel like your proximity to the culture from which this comes from gives you special license to write music about it?
A culture is a process, and it's a living process made by living people. And like we're all building collectively cultures. I just feel like in NextNotes, one of those amazing discussions that we had with mentors, the one point that really, really, really struck me is just humility, the importance of that, like acknowledging that we're all parts of the mosaic.
You know, right now we're living at the intersection of so many
Mm.
different things, so many different challenges. What do you see as your role as a creator of music?
best part of art to me is just like the process of performing, or like just like making music and in real time or not, but connecting with those that the music has the honor to touch and to reach. That's just the best, most rewarding part of art making to me. And thinking about accessibility is definitely part of it. Like the struggle between authenticity, or I don't know, like authenticity should always be a constant, but just like thinking about who the music is going to reach, the audience, is also a big part. And storytelling is another facet of art that was just like great, because stories can have the power to heal, have the power to destroy.
Helen, what's coming up for you next? What can people expect to hear from you in the future?
Like NextNotes is a wonderful start. Like just like being friends, like becoming friends with like the people, the fellow students.
Yes.
Just like we've been emailing and like, you know, like sending recordings and all that stuff. I'm just really excited to be with these kinds of people. And also just like, oh yeah, I'm thinking about doing a project on myth and the power of myth and different versions of telling the same story, like a kind of installation. So that is a project that really just motivates me to like, because like, you know, myth has so much power. Stories have so much power. It's a matter of, it's like technology. It's like the way people use it matters.
Right.
So same as stories. So that is a project that's coming up.
Wow. Well, we're looking forward to keeping up with you. Helen, thank you so much for talking.
Thank you.
Really
And thank you so much. This has been so inspiring.
She believes that the one thing that should remain constant over time is compassion and also respect. Miss Helen Fung, thank you so much for your work and congratulations on your award. Well, I'd like to invite y'all down to Kentucky next. That's where the next honoree calls home. Her name is KiMani Bridges. As I'm sure you know, in addition to dealing with COVID, the nation is grappling with unrest in response to the killings of Louisville's Breonna Taylor and many, many others. KiMani's approach to music isn't so much a response to that reality, but I think you can definitely consider it a reflection of the times. You see, she loves to write music in those dark minor keys, and after watching a war documentary, she decided to put those not so sunny aesthetics into a piece of music that she called Gray. Let's hear from KiMani.
I think your affinity for more minor key music makes the title of the piece of music that you wrote make a little bit more sense to me. Gray. I mean, is it just the color, or is it more of a gray feeling that you were thinking about as you wrote it?
Well, the title was the hardest part of that piece, and I was like, this is about like war, so things smoke, and smoke's kind of like gray, and that's how I came up with the title. Yeah.
About war. Tell me more about that. Why did you choose that as a topic?
I was watching a documentary about World War II on YouTube, and, and I just started getting ideas of like the different things I wanted to write for the piece because I had no clue I wanted to write, and so it kind of just like I built like a story in my head for like the different like phases, like someone initiating the war, then the preparation, the actual war, and the aftermath of it. And I thought that would be something I could follow along to write the piece.
Yeah, I'm curious about the impetus of your the beginning of your composition career. Was there a moment? Was there a person that you met that kind of pushed you into that world?
I was having a little problem wording, understanding what the orchestral repertoire was and how the music worked. And I was like, maybe if I take the composition class, I'll understand more about the music's already there. But it kind of did, but it opened up like more stuff for me to do.
Yeah, you found yourself on a path that you didn't expect. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about some of those things that you say you didn't understand about orchestral music. I mean, have things cleared up? Has the grayness cleared up for you?
It has a lot. One of my big issues, like I was like, I don't want to play if I don't understand what it means. If I understood like what each of this meant, like I really didn't understand what phrasing was really, or passages and how things connect and how things show up again. I was like, maybe if I learn how things are work, I can fix or better myself in flute playing.
Do you think that sort of story, that outside narrative, is a necessary part of a piece of music? Because there are a lot of people who just believe in art for art's sake, music for music's sake.
I'm not really like an abstract kind of person, so I have to have something to follow, or else I'm going to get frustrated and get lost.
Wow. That's me too. So.
It's like the story helps because it gets you like kind of like it's kind of like acting, so it gets you like in a headspace of what the person is trying to write, and it give you like more ideas, and we could watch like kind of movies that kind of references that kind of follow like the same storyline, and you try to understand them more because you actually seen it in a way.
How does your being a flute player impact the way you write for five flutes? I mean, I'm sure you have a better understanding of the different sounds that the instrument is capable of than just the common person.
Yeah, so the reason is for five flutes. Well, that's great. It's like the first piece I've ever written. And so the reason for five was because I was in chamber class. And so I didn't want to play by myself. And so it's like, I'll just make everyone play. I tried to make the flute tone dark. And so I really kept it like in the mid range and the lower range of the flute. I don't remember if I ever went so far into third octave, but I just try to get, because you really want to hear it on the flute, like the dark tones of the flute. And I was like, maybe I could use that to make this work, and it did work. So
How easy or how difficult is it for you to find five flute players or maybe four other flute players if you want to be involved in performances of this piece?
um working with high schoolers, because all the people that worked with me were a year younger than me except for one person. And so practice wise, if it wasn't in school, it was very difficult to get into practice. But I don't I don't think it would be hard because I'm going to college, and maybe there'll probably be someone around. And if I can't get like performance, I'll just play them all myself and record it. Like
There you go. Yeah. What does your family think about your blooming career as a composer and a musician? Do you come from a musical family at all?
they were surprised about my career choice, and they're really proud of me for all like the stuff I've done, and they're really supportive of it.
Yeah, I know for me, I'm a first generation college student, college graduate, musician, all of that. So it seems like, I'll just say for folks that look like us, the firsts are still happening. But it's really encouraging for me to see you so excited about what's coming up next for you.
Yeah.
You,
I
I'll go ahead. Yeah.
I am very, very excited. I actually just finished my first commission piece, so that's cool.
Who is it a commission from?
It was from a local festival here called the Festival of Faves. It was supposed to happen in April, but it's happening. So they had a theme for the whole thing, but you can't, when you're writing music, you can't really tell someone what to write. And so I tried, and so the piece is called Uplifted. And so I try to keep it in the theme, but I still keep my own like style into it. And it was kind of a learning process that you can't be forced to write something. That's what I learned from it.
For the young people listening, the folks just opening up that instrument case for the first time in elementary school or middle school, what advice would you give to them? I mean, you're a senior currently, but you've already had a very successful career. What would you say to these people beginning their journey?
Stick with it. It find a piece that you like, not like those like hard pieces. You probably can't play those yet. I don't know if you're a prodigy now, but you probably can't play it yet. So go find like pop songs or melodies, something that you like really enjoy. And then once you start getting into it, then ask like your teacher for like a book or something. And see if you like that. If you like that, then continue it. If you don't, go, I will still stick with it, but go back and find something else you enjoy, and then try to incorporate that into something you're learning.
Gray is the perfect title to that piece of music, isn't it? Gray in color, gray in mood, even a little gray mystery in there. Wow, thank you and congratulations again to KiMani Bridges. Well, I'd like to spice things up a bit and introduce you to tonight's next honoree. His name is Angelo Nucal. I know it's hard to imagine being in a crowd full of people after spending so much time physically and socially distanced, but that's exactly where you'll have to put yourself to understand Gene's perspective on his winning piece of music. You see, he's big on the idea of identity, and while exploring his own Filipino heritage, he discovered that the area was also highly influenced by Spanish culture. So with that in mind, he created his own musical ode to identity and the tradition of Spanish street musicians and block parties. It's a work called Street of the Trill, or as Gene titled it, Calle de los Trinos. Here are a few words from Gene.
Was this your first sort of recognition as a composer?
Yes, it was.
Oh wow! So I guess it was especially exciting. Paint that picture for me. Talk to me about reading that email or getting that phone call the moment you found out.
So when Miss Kreider had called me first, I wasn't able to get to the phone. So it was one of those like, oh, somebody called me. If they need to call me, if they need to reach me, then they can go ahead and call me back again. She did. She left a voicemail, and then I was like, oh my goodness, I need to call her back. So then I did, and then I was like, oh, what is this? I was like thinking in my head, like, what is this all about? And she was like, well, I have some good news regarding NextNotes. You've been chosen as a finalist. And I was like, what? Are you kidding? Like I was like speechless. If like, even if you asked her, I was just like, oh, wow, thank you. Oh my goodness, thank you.
When it comes to your composition, I understand that you're interested in pushing the envelope, pushing the needle. What does that mean to you to sort of push the needle, to challenge the status quo?
I guess for me as a composer right now, I'm focusing more on like string stuff, but I wanted to push like beyond just like hits and arco. I wanted to go like full on extended techniques if I could, because whenever I would play on my cello and I was just like in like that space between like practice and like me giving up, I would always just like figure out a random way to play something. And then I was like, huh, that's kind of interesting. I wonder what that would sound like.
So first of all, my Spanish is not great, so you'll have to tell me what this title means, Calle de los Trinos.
Yes. So Calle de los Trinos translates to Street of the Trills.
That's
And
what I thought. Yeah.
so I actually asked my Spanish teacher. She's a Spain native, or a Spanish native, and I was like, "Hey, I'm doing a piece kind of structured around flamenco, and I was wondering if you could help me like name it." So she was like, "Okay, so here's what I hear. What are you going for first?" And I was like, I was going for like a street band kind of thing. And she was like, "Calle, street. Let's start with that." So she was like, "I hear a lot of trills. I hear a lot of palmas, which is the clapping." So I was like, "Okay." And then she was like, "You could do it like." You could call it flamenco de this, or like calle de this. And I was like, okay. So I have like all these words. I have like something that I can draw off of. And then I just went home and I was like looking at it. I said, Calle de los Trinos sounds like the one that rolls off the tongue for me. And then the one that kind of like fits it the most for like what I was thinking. So that's how I chose the name even. So.
And who knows, maybe there will be a Trill Street in your honor one day. Do you think your identity, however we're talking about, whether that's, being a young person, being a Filipino descent, does that play a role in all of your music, or is that idea exclusive to this composition?
Sometimes Filipino culture kind of does get drowned out, I think. Maybe that's just like my American way of thinking, where it's like not many people know about Filipino culture, even like fellow Filipinos. But I kind of just want to like kind of a renaissance, like a revival of like Filipino culture. And then of course, maybe even pre-colonial times, because not a lot of people know about that either, including myself. I've tried to look it up and it's just like there's a lot of colonization that's happened to where it's kind of been drowned out. So.
Yeah, and that's one of the great things about music, is that it can kind of give us a picture into, this world that we may not have been exposed to in the past.
Yeah.
I wonder if you thought about the long history of what the piano quintet is in its traditional sense when you decided to shake things up with a flamenco-inspired piano quintet.
I would say yes, in a way, because I wanted to take like that classical, like classical structure of like an ensemble, and I wanted to mold that to fit like a genre. So rather than having like, oh, we have a guitar here, we have a cajon here, we have like palmas here, and we have like people who are dancing that are also percussion because of their movements and their sounds. So I was like, how about we just condense that into this? How can we make how can I make the ensemble feel like the street band? How can I give an illusion almost?
When I think about that title, Calle de los Trinos, you know, I'm thinking about, I have an image of this, this almost like a block party or you know, folks out in the streets having fun. But as you know, COVID has really diminished a lot of that public, activity. I wonder if this pandemic has had a unique impact on your music or your composition process.
I guess with the times that we're in, I haven't really like focused in on like trying to convert that into music or like what I'm feeling so much. So I want to say my music hasn't been influenced a lot by the pandemic, but I've been like creatively, I've been like sensitive to like what's been going on. So it's just, I guess as an artist rather than a composer, I have been affected by the pandemic.
In a number of the conversations I've had with your cohort, one of the main things that comes up is how cool it is for them to sort of meet other high school age kids who are into composition. And well, what's been your experience with NextNotes?
I felt like I was in a position to learn from them, like a lot from them. So they were like throwing names and I was like name dropping and I was like, oh, I don't know who this composer is. Let me look them up. And they're like techniques, this, that, this, and everyone kind of, well, not everyone, but like there felt like there was a group understanding. And then I was just like, oh, okay. So I kind of need to catch up because I was like, I need to figure out how I'm going to do this. But being with them, it was just like, it felt like such a fountain of knowledge, even from like the mentors, but also the students. So I guess it was just like really surprising to find out how passionate they were about what they do, and even at a young age. So then I was like, it was inspiring for me, very much so.
See what I mean by spicing things up a little bit? I hope you enjoyed listening to that. Thank you and congratulations again to Angelo Nucal. So before I let you meet the rest of tonight's NextNotes honorees, I thought it might be good for you to get an inside look at another important aspect of the program, mentorship. As I mentioned a little earlier, this year's honorees had the privilege of working with Marcos Balter, Mary Ellen Childs, and Joe Horton. I also had the pleasure of meeting them, and I'd like to share with you a bit of the conversation that we had yesterday.
So the word composer has been one that folks are kind of exploring or reconsidering lately. I wonder if the three of you can speak to the implication of the word composer or the idea of being a composer.
I think part of the fight of people trying to recontextualize the word composer or trying to understand what it is trying to remove it a little bit from its like officialness, you know, where it's like there's certain etiquettes associated with the word, and those never fit with me either. And so I don't think it's a dirty word at all. And when people put it under my name, when I see like Joe Horton composer, I am flattered. You know, I'm like, oh man, check me out. But I think it's like with Marcos and Mary Ellen, I think they're so much more, you know, versed, and their body of work is so much more established or whatever. So I think of them as like composers in a term of like respect. And myself, I just see myself as like using tools that I have at my disposal, like sound and you know, instruments and, you know, whatever. I also write on Ableton. I don't write things down. So I feel like to be a composer, I think you kind of have to be able to write music, like to be worthy of the term. They're shaking their heads, but I'm going to stick to that. I'm sticking to it.
I think of that word very broadly. And it would never occur to me that a composer is only somebody who sort of puts black marks on a page. That hasn't been part of my concept of composer for maybe forever, but certainly not for a very long time. You know, and I also do a lot of work across various kinds of art forms, and I see the word used in a lot of different art forms. So in many segments of the dance world, there are, you know, you study dance composition. And in the perfume world, there are composers. And so to me, it really has more of the connotation of someone who creates.
We were talking a little bit earlier about, you know, Eurocentrism and Afrocentrism. And I think that composer itself as a term has a very strong Eurocentric origin, you know. So I feel that it is a title that is bestowed upon us, and we as creators learn how to deal with. You know, it's the chain that we learn how to make just loose enough that we can feel, you know, comfortable owning. But I would include in the category of composition anyone who curates sound in a structural way. And when I say structural, I don't mean music that requires a very solid structure, but I'm talking really about the curatorship of the modality or the curatorship of the experience. It's someone that intentionally organizes a sonic event and even sometimes the participation of others in that sonic event in a way that is meaningful for them. And to Joe's point, I think that notation is only one of the modalities which one can engage with in order to create those events.
You use that word structure, and between the among the three of you and among some of the NextNotes recipients, award recipients, you know, the idea of improvisation is an aspect. Marcos, I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that, how, you know, improvisation can be structured, you know, as we talk about what is a composer and defining a composer.
Oh, most of improvisation is structured, right? I mean, the concept of improvising, you know, in order for one to engage with improvisation, one needs to engage. And if you're improvising by yourself, you're engaging with yourself. You're engaging with yourself temporally. You are having a conversation with the things that you were about to say and the things that you just said. So even when a solitary act, you know, that it's still making those connections. And when you're improvising with others, it's about listening. I mean, and improvisation to me, going back to the idea of what is Eurocentric and Afrocentric, is at the very core of the Afrocentric experience. You know, it's really what in many ways sometimes differs, you know, the purely Eurocentric music from an Afrocentric perspective is the simultaneity of, you know, multiple conversations. It's the necessity of that creative connection that is instantaneous and organic in the musical discourse.
Engaging with yourself, you know, solitary acts, that's something that I think we've all become a little bit more engaged in this COVID era, engaging with oneself. So a lot of the NextNotes Award recipients spoke with me about how, you know, that reality has made NextNotes even more impactful for them, having that community of peers interested in the same thing. Is that something that you found while working with these young composers? I'll use that word.
Yeah, well, it's a little bit of a paradox, isn't it? Because we're together, but we're apart. So, and you know, that's part of the time that we're in right now, and finding ways to connect and be part of a group, but also we're each in our separate spaces. And I think that's been a really unique aspect of the NextNotes this year and the way that we've all been able to be together. I think being able to connect this way has worked very well, and in a way it's allowed us to do some things that apparently don't usually happen in NextNotes. Like, we've been meeting since May as a cohort. We've been meeting over a much longer period of time, so in a way we may have not have had more hours together, but we've had more time together because it's spread out over more weeks. On the other hand, it is different when you're all in the same physical space together. There's just no getting around that. There's just there are some differences in the way you connect, the way you form relationships. So I think that's been different.
Joe, earlier you know, in addition to identifying yourself as a composer, you said that you worked in the world of rap. For a lot of people, what these NextNotes award recipients are doing and the world of rap or hip hop might not seem exactly complementary. I wonder how your sort of atypical background and approach to creating music and creating art was a tool for you to engage these young artists.
So I've been rapping my whole life. I think I feel that way. Whether that's true or not, that's what my life is. That's what my like sense of self was built around. In every scene, you're gonna have people that are stifled by the scene, that feel like that they're sort of like culturally mandated to like certain things or to act certain ways. And I found a great liberation in being able to pop into one place, pop into another place, and sort of exchange and mix up information from different scenes. And I've also found a great human undercurrent that has become my sort of shtick. Like, when I talk to people about anything, whether it's rap, you can't tell me ODB wasn't a mystic. But you absolutely cannot. You cannot tell me John Coltrane wasn't a mystic. We were talking about Arvo Pärt earlier, an Estonian composer. My man Arvo is a mystic. And so that felt so beautiful to me, to be like, to find just a beautiful symmetry between ODB and Arvo Pärt is just, that's all. I mean, that's amazing. That's so amazing. And I love people. I'm just like fascinated by people. And so I think, you know, it's no, I think dipping into a lot of different musical scenes is really no different than traveling a bunch and being like a well-traveled person, is that you're going to have your countries that you're more familiar with. Like, you know, I've been to France once, but that doesn't mean I really understand the culture. But going there informed and shaped the way that I see the world, and having spent time in foreign places has opened up the way that I see things. And so really, I think that's what it is. I try to get to that ground of humanity, like the ground of what music is always for all people. And then I think it's really on the composers themselves to flesh out their own idiosyncratic cultural like things that they have to say. Like, I don't have anything to say about what they have to say. They should have to say something about that. Really, all I want to do is mix the pot up.
A lot of these young artists engage the concept of identity more than I expected. These young artists too. Is that sense of identity one that you saw among these young artists?
You know, we talked a little bit about that, and I think that it is a natural tendency for any young artist to think of finding one's voice, right? I mean, some people embark in this sort of quest of like, I must find my voice in order to have validity. And one thing that I tell my students, and I talk to these young composers about that, is that in my opinion, in my humble opinion, style, which seems to be sort of like the holy grail that they want to, you know, acquire or belong to, style is a consequence. It's never a cause. And in many ways, when one talks about one's voice, one is talking in retrospect. One is talking about where one is coming from and dealing with. And that trust that your voice will come to you rather than you going towards your voice is a very hard one to establish. You know, I mean, I think that people have a tendency of wanting to belong to a lineage or wanting to fit in a specific, you know, sound world or artistic world, even in terms of, you know, gaining a sense of acceptance, you know, like artistic acceptance or any other kind of like herd mentality that we fall for as artists. And but the reality is, you know, as you can and maybe you should be as free as possible, you know, in whatever path you choose. and and we can like we as human beings are conditioned to look for patterns. We are conditioned to look for consistency, you know. So even the most idiosyncratic journey, you know, will yield, you know, patterns, and we can draw meaning from it. So forget about meaning and just do your thing, and meaning will be assigned to you regardless.
So the word composer has been one.
Thanks again to Mary Ellen, Joe, and Marcos. If you'd like to check out our entire conversation, be sure to keep an eye on the ACF website. That's composersforum.org. So I've already laid out that NextNotes supports all music of all kinds, but think about the phrase classical music. How do you define it? It's a big conversation these days, and a point that I always try to make is that there has been so-called classical music happening for centuries, far before there was a Mozart, a Haydn, or even a Bach. I make that point by pointing folks to the age-old traditions of East Asian music and Indian classical music, something that tonight's next honoree is fairly familiar with himself. His name is Rohan Srinivasan. He says that his father is big on the tradition of classical music from India, but Rohan engages music in his own way. His own experiences as a drummer and as a cellist inspired in part the creation of a work that he called a dialogue, music for cello and piano. I'll tell you, he and I had a great dialogue, one that I enjoyed very much. Here's a bit of that conversation.
You talk a lot about your teachers and your mentors, and I have to admit, you know, I play the bassoon, so you know I'm very familiar with what a music lesson is. But what is a composition lesson like?
It's very different because it's not like there's one way to compose. Unlike, I mean, I guess there's not one way to play an instrument either, but it's a bit more clear. So usually my teacher would just give me suggestions, and usually his suggestions are good and they make sense musically. I mean, obviously you can kind of do whatever you want in composition, but you have to have a good reason for doing it.
Sure.
And like he's okay with me experimenting and doing whatever as long as I have a good basis for doing that.
Yeah, as long as it's thought out. And I actually wanted to sort of explore that word composer or composition with you, because I know you know, improvisation is something that you've explored and something that you experiment with as a performer and someone who writes music. I mean, is an improvisation something that you also consider a composition?
But I've heard it be called spontaneous composition. And
Oh, sure.
and yeah, I tend to agree with that. I mean there's a lot of thought that goes into it, and in the end some of the improvisations I've heard sound no different than notated compositions.
Yeah, help us understand that idea of a lot going into an improvisation, because I'm sure many people would just consider it random playing, so-called random playing, but it's so much more than that, I'm sure.
There are many different types of improvisation, and some of the pieces are pretty complex because they combine improvised sections with notated sections, and you can't really you can't really tell where one begins and one ends. You could improvise in some sort of system, like I guess in earlier jazz you'd be improvising in some kind of key or progression, and then later on you might be improvising over like shapes that you see, or some type of articulation. You might be focusing on that. There's always this like intuitive thing you feel when you're hearing it, that you know it make there's some type of logic to it, that it's not random. It's hard to describe how you feel that when you're hearing it.
But you
But
just know that you hear it when you're hearing it, or you know that you're feeling it when you feel it.
yeah, you just know it's not random.
Why did you choose the title of dialogue? Is it, do you see it as a sort of musical conversation between cello and piano?
Yeah, definitely. And I didn't pick the title until after I was done with the piece. So once I was finished, I realized that the cello and piano kind of have two different personalities, and
Yeah.
they keep exchanging roles throughout the piece. Like the piano is kind of flowing and mostly quiet, and the cello is kind of aggressive. The piano tries to keep moving on, but the cello keeps like kind of interrupting it. But there's kind of a resolution in the end. It's not the most aggressive like resolution. Yeah, the piece kind of just ends all of a sudden, and I mean, I suppose the dialogue is left open.
Who are some of the composers that have inspired you? I mean, are they among them, or is it completely fresh for you?
I like Ligeti a lot.
Ligeti, okay.
And he's one of my favorite composers because um, the music sounds the music is might be like dissonant and aggressive, but there's still a sense of humor to it that I can sense with the like crazy rhythms. I guess it's not too fun for the players, but it's fun for a listener.
We began our conversation by talking about, COVID and protests and this very different world that we're all living in. Do you see yourself? Do you see yourself as a composer? The music you write evolving or being different in response to this new reality?
I don't know if there's been a big change in my music because of the new reality, but I do feel that there's kind of a responsibility to respond to it in some shape or form. By nature, I don't like to involve myself in things where when I don't know enough about like enough about the circumstances, or I'm not like connected with it.
Sure, but even so, you've acknowledged that you feel the need, this responsibility to respond in some way. I mean, what might that response look like for you? Is it more chamber music? Is it more orchestral music? Well, what do you foresee in the future?
I like chamber music. That's my favorite type of music to write. So,
Why is chamber music your favorite?
well, it's more intimate, and I have a greater connection with it because, and then when I'm rehearsing the piece, it's not like there's 100 players I have to speak to.
Are there any questions that you feel like I didn't cover, or anything that you want to tell the world with this opportunity?
Well, I guess I'll say thanks for the opportunity. Um, this has been it's been pretty fun so far because I've I've never met so many people that like the composers I like in one room before. So that's pretty exciting.
It sounds like NextNotes has connected you to folks that you have a lot in common with.
Yes, thank you for completing my sentence. Yeah.
Uh,
You know, a conductor once told me that playing music with another person is almost the most intimate thing that two people can do together. Well, it's a musical intimacy that I'm sure countless pianists and cellists will engage in through that piece of music for ages to come. Thank you and congratulations to Rohan Srinivasan for that piece of music called A Dialogue. So this thing called social distancing has put a stop to lots of those intimate and personal moments, hasn't it? Folks around the world are dealing with it the best way they can, including tonight's next honoree, Miss Charlotte Weinstein. She's based in Brooklyn, New York, and one of her favorite things to do was to play in the Kaufman Music Center's Face the Music Philharmonic. It's an ensemble focused on music by living composers. Well, like so many other things, that's moved onto the digital stage. And while she wrote her winning piece of music before this pandemic, she acknowledges that it's still a really timely composition. It's called Disequilibrium, something that just about everyone has experienced at this point, right? Well, it's something that you'll be able to hear really well in her piece of music, too. Here's a bit of my chat with Charlotte.
Charlotte, the first thing I wanted to ask you was about the phrase music creator. So when I read your bio, I didn't see the word composer anywhere. But what do you think about those two phrases, composer versus music creator?
Composition for me is not a strict act of writing down. It's not a strict act of software. It's not like a strict act that only humans can do, and it's just limited to. And instead, I feel like my music, especially with my piece about bugs, is derived from the music of the outside world, and how we choose to interpret that as composition, really.
Do you feel like living in a city makes your music sound different than if maybe you were upstate or somewhere more rural?
When I was upstate, I didn't really formally start composition. I only formally started it last year, so I don't know for sure, but there is definitely this idea of this unique sense of chaos, and there is definitely an idea of this unique sense of the tipping point of a lot of different factors. You know, it's very polluted. It's very, there's a lot happening, and a lot of people are very dense, so it's sort
of crowded.
Yeah, so I don't know whether that would actually makes my music feel more crowded than it actually is, but it's also good to find silence when you're living in a crowded place too. So I don't know.
What would you say to people who can't quite understand what you're talking about as far as the composition of music not being this strict thing, but just the way things happen, for lack of a better phrase? Well, what do you say to the people that can't really wrap their minds around that being tied to composition, this thing that we usually think of as being pretty formal?
Yes, composition is writing stuff down, putting stuff on paper, making a very formal score that you can print out and hand to musicians, but it has to have a purpose other than that. And I would say that a larger purpose, I really like the way you put it about the way things happen, and you sort of see what you want to hear and the beauty in all of these different forms of music that you sort of see outside, and making something fresh from that is really why we put notes on paper, why we want people to remember our making of music.
So with that, I'm also thinking about the title of your string quartet, Disequilibrium. I mean, what are some of the conversations that you have with yourself or with your music as it applies to the sort of randomness of today and the so-called randomness of your music?
Frankly, my piece now needs to be updated to reflect a sort of new sense of unrest and disequilibrium. When I talk about disequilibrium between, you know, animals or bugs in the environment and humans sort of throwing that off. And when I think about disequilibrium, I think of all of these things that are going on today, and how humans have sort of impacted this great disequilibrium of the ecosystem. And then you think about how a pandemic has sort of impacted the ecosystem in that way, and it's really and it's really, I feel like my piece definitely took on a new light now.
Is there anything that you would like, you know, your fellow composers to understand? Any words of advice to kids who are interested in composition?
I think that it's more important to discover how to find your own intentions. And when you're going through music, like the mentors were in a workshop sort of making this analogy of somebody pulling a rope out of a hole, and you're sort of discovering not really the rope, but sort of what's on the other side of that hole in the wall. And I think that Joe was telling me a lot about how music is sort of connected to a very deep part of your soul, where you want to have a ritual and where you want to sort of connect very powerfully to your own intuition and to other people's intuitions about music. And I think he was saying about it being a language to express the beauty that we really hear and see in our everyday lives. And how do we want to see that? And a lot of the time we're put in very controlled environments, and increasingly with the internet and social media, and especially during this pandemic, there's sort of this disconnect. But if we think about what we want to hear and what we want to see for ourselves, and how we want to guide our own interpretation of what we hear and what other people hear, then that's where we really start creating. And it's not necessarily control that inspires that.
Charlotte, the first thing I wanted to ask you,
Could you hear how Charlotte used music to represent those bugs and other creatures that she described in our interview? I should mention that Charlotte was this year's youngest winner, so she has a really bright future ahead of her. Congratulations to Charlotte Weinstein. So before I introduce you to the final NextNotes honoree for the evening, the team here at the American Composers Forum wanted to share with you some collected wisdom from our very own composer and creator community. Take a look.
Busta Rhymes is as much of a composer as Mendelssohn, as far as I'm concerned. And I think that once you embrace the validity of what's really ringing in your head and ringing in your heart, a lot of music will write itself.
When people say to follow your gut or to know your intuition, that's something that you hone over time, but that's a gift.
You're an artist. Everything you do is unique to you. That's why you're an artist, because you only sound like you. The only person that you're in competition with is yourself.
Really write the music that you love and that speaks to your soul. If you have a passion for bass clarinet and dubstep, put those together and see what that sounds like.
I come from Brazil. One of the most obvious things about Brazil are the rhythms that we have so many different syncopated rhythms and colorful drumming and all of that. So I really like to take that into my music and make it into something new, try to change it to something new.
I can actually tell you with all honesty that you must collaborate with people that you're going to grow old with.
Writing music doesn't have to be a totally isolated experience. Write music for people around you. Let them hear what it is that you've written. Preferably get them to play what it is that you've written. But most of all, don't sit there by yourself thinking no one else is interested, because they are. And I can't wait to see what NextNotes provides. It's a fantastic opportunity. Get writing.
Really go after whatever you're attracted to. Nothing can stop you. Your attraction is yours.
Play or sing. Play an instrument or sing in a choir and some sort of ensemble. Be curious about everything. Listen as much as you can to all kinds of music. Read as much as you can. All sorts of things.
I think, and this is something I still do, you should take maybe 20 minutes to an hour every day and listen to music with a score or not. It can be music you don't know, it can be music you like, it can be music you know really well, it can be music you dislike, I think is equally important, or music you think you dislike, and then eventually the idea is that you'll start to like it.
Find your music your heroes in your music and study them, understand, their language, and use that as a jumping off point for your own language, but be super passionate and be in love with the process.
Don't dismiss something just because it seems like a bad idea. It might just mean that it's an unfamiliar idea. And at the very least, it probably won't be a boring one.
I guess the best way I can say it is that just you do it. You have to take the risk.
Keep making music. I think that's good.
Keep making music indeed, something that I hope tonight's final honoree will do for sure. His name is Jasper Talwani, and in addition to having a deep love and appreciation for music and mac and cheese, I'll add, Jasper is huge on the subject of linguistics. I actually had to dip my toe into linguistics myself to understand the perspective he brought with his winning composition. Eschatology, a piece of music written for drum set, double bass, piano, guitar, trumpet, alto, and tenor saxophone, and violin. That word eschatology is a reference to the end of the world, Armageddon, you could say, and the drama of that idea is something that Jasper couldn't stay away from. It's not all scary though. I think you'll hear that his winning composition is filled with lots of that music, lots of that sound you might call jazz, the perfect backdrop for his home over in Southern California. Here's a bit of the conversation that I had with Jasper.
In music, you sort of have to make something and have it out there and have it be done. And that can be really, really hard for us composers because you want it to be perfect and you want every single ingredient to be super fine-tuned, but that's not always how it works. Sometimes you have a gig. Sometimes you have a concert. Sometimes you only have 4 rehearsals left and you're halfway through the piece, and you need to have something to hand out to people. And so what you do is you take out the box of macaroni. So if you want a metaphor, there's your metaphor.
You improvise.
Yeah, exactly.
We're doing a really great job just across the board and at ACF of sort of exploring and redefining that word composer. There's a lot that is surrounded around that, and many so-called classical music words, including the word jazz, and you identify as a jazz composer. Can you talk a little about that?
I write improvised music. I live and play in a genre created by African Americans to explain and talk about their historical struggle, I should say. And I sort of feel very blessed to be able to play that music and compose that music. And for me to pretend it was anything else would seem to me to be kind of appropriative, for one. And that's something that I feel like a lot of composers need to be aware of, is where their music comes from. In terms of the word composer, I mean, I actually used to be kind of uncomfortable with the word composer because all my siblings are classical composers, and I was a classical composer for like a bit, and it always felt sort of constraining to me, this like idea of you sit on your desk and you compose this immaculate piece of music, and you get a bunch of adults who have been to the conservatory to perform it in a recital or something. It just always seems sort of constraining, and because of that, it was hard for me to get into jazz composing. But at the end of the day, I sort of realized that it's just a bunch of people making tunes and playing each other's tunes and commenting on it, and so this collaborative process. And I really enjoy that process and environment a lot more than I enjoy the processes and environments in making classical music.
Sure.
Yeah.
You openly and almost matter-of-factly affirm so-called jazz as a Black American creation. And as we all look at how what we do has a relationship and impacts with the world today, a world in which we're taking another look at the conversation of race. I wonder if that has had an impact on you when it comes to your approach to writing this Black musical creation.
This time has definitely been like such an important time, I think, for all of us to re-examine our beliefs and re-examine our ties to these systems of oppression, and re-examine ways that we can dismantle them. And in terms of music, to me, it makes me even more committed because I mean, really not just jazz, but pretty much every single form of American music, I think you could really argue, is Black American music, and is totally indebted. I mean, everything Ariana Grande has ever written, everything that anybody's ever written practically in pop, and then the music that Americans have exported to the rest of the world, it's Black American music.
In preparation for this conversation, I actually had to learn a new word, eschatology. Why don't you tell folks in your words how you define eschatology and why you chose that as the title for your NextNotes composition?
Well, I'd probably say about that I'm generally very, very bad at choosing titles, and I have like maybe a dozen tunes on my phone that don't have titles, and it always takes me forever, and I never feel satisfied with the title. And with eschatology, I was sort of grappling with a bunch of different titles, but I had sort of thought of it and sort of left it in the back burner, the idea of naming a tune eschatology, because it's such a sort of a fun word, and it looks fun. And also what it means, I guess it's the, not that I'm any kind of theology expert, but apparently it's the part of like world religions where it talks about Armageddon and the end of the world, and God judges over all of us and everything goes to crap. And then hopefully maybe there's peace afterwards, we don't know. And to me, that's really interesting, the way that humans have throughout history thought about the end of the world and thought about themselves in relation to the end of the world. And part of the condition of being human is this understanding that none of us are permanent, that our existence on this earth is limited, and that the existence of our species on this earth is also limited. And other animals don't have that awareness, and so we sort of have to grapple with that. philosophically. I was sort of going for a very anxious, tumbling piece of music that would reflect, something of what me and probably a lot of other people feel about living in this time.
Yeah, but because you're so cognizant of, the events that are going on today and how these events connect with different conversations and different fields, I thought I'd round things out with a question concerning that relationship between music and the world. For the music creator, for the composer who has yet to receive some of the recognition and accolades that you have, creators who don't yet have the communities that things like NextNotes creates. What is your advice to them? What are your words to those people trying to engage the world through their art, through their music?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I'm really qualified to give advice to anybody, but I think that with music, what you really just got to do is create. I'm not used to really framing myself as a composer. I'm just sort of a person who writes music. And so, being in a room with like 7 people who say, I am a composer. What we do is compose. Let's talk about composing. How do we do that? What are some techniques and tips and strategies and thoughts, and what are the existential implications, and blah blah blah. And we have these like really long, weird philosophical discussions about what you should do if your musician doesn't like your music, and stuff like that. As I said, it's a really different way of framing that conversation to what I'm used to, and I think it's a really good way of thinking about it. Not just as I'm somebody who writes music and I bring in a tune and then it is fully formed and then we have a gig. It's like that's something you spend a lot of time crafting and thinking about, because that is what I do. I craft and think about my pieces. But yeah, it's definitely been really beneficial to me to be able to talk about music in a group of really, really smart people who make really cool music.
I have to say, it was so much fun talking with Jasper. He has an easygoing spirit that matches his music really well. Thank you and congratulations to Jasper Talwani. Each creator who you've met this evening will receive support for their future studies and resources to showcase their music in their hometowns. The scholarship support is provided by the Thelma Hunter Fund. Thelma was an enthusiastic supporter of the next generation of composers and creators, and in honor of her spirit and legacy, family members of Thelma are tuning in tonight. Thank you very much for joining us all here. I'd also like to thank Make Music Incorporated. Thanks to them, each creator will receive a finale subscription for continued creation and experimentation. They've also provided the Smart Music digital program for each creator's teacher. Additionally, Noteflight has graciously offered a free 1-year subscription to Noteflight Premium for all of the creators who applied to NextNotes. So a big thank you as well to all of this year's NextNotes applicants. I'd like to thank all of the generous supporters of the American Composers Forum who have made tonight possible. A big thanks to Patrick Pegg and the Fix Agency for their technical support. Thanks to the incomparable Laura Kreider. She works as the ACF's Director of Education and Community Partnerships, and she actually facilitated all of the interviews that you saw tonight. So a big thank you to Laura. I'd like to thank each of this year's creators and mentors, and most importantly, I'd like to thank you. Thank you for joining us this evening, and thank you for your continued support for the American Composers Forum. As an institution focused on racial equity, anti-racism, inclusion, and support for artists and creators, it's been my extreme honor to serve on the board for the American Composers Forum and to be your host for tonight's NextNotes Award ceremony. I hope you'll be well, and I hope you'll continue to support the American Composers Forum. Here's to the future of creative music. Peace.